Today on Inside Utah Politics, Representative Chris Stewart. He's here to weigh in on some of the hot topics of the day, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, inflation, and more. And a federal judge putting an end to the transportation mask mandate, how the Biden administration is reacting.
Time now for Inside Utah Politics.
Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Glenn Mills. It is time to go inside Utah politics. We do begin this morning with Representative Chris Stewart. He's here to discuss some of the big issues on the national stage. Representative, great to have you back on the show. Thanks for making time for us.
Hey, it's always great to be with you. Thank you.
Let's get right into the Russia invasion of Ukraine. Really interested in your insight when it comes to the Intelligence Committee. I know there are some things you can't tell us, but what are some things maybe the average American doesn't know that you can talk about?
You know, we've actually been pretty open with some of the information that we have been able to receive, and the intelligence that we've gotten on Ukraine and on Russia and on Russian leader Vladimir Putin has been actually pretty exquisite. So much so, Glenn, that we started saying as early as late October, early November, Vladimir Putin is going to invade Ukraine. And the President of the United States started saying it very, very definitively in December and January. He's going to invade Ukraine. We tried to convince President Zelensky. We tried to convince NATO. Most of them, I think, agreed with us, and maybe a few exceptions, France being notable among them. But you know, one interesting thing that we did during that time period was the intelligence community went to Ukraine and actually to Russia and some surrounding nations, and we asked them to do some polling. How will the Ukrainian people respond? What will they do? And the thing we got back from them was really interesting. It was really clear the Ukrainian people were going to fight. They did not want to live under the thumb of Vladimir Putin. Mm-hmm. And Vladimir Putin really, we understood the Ukrainian people more than Vladimir Putin did. And he calls them his brothers and his sisters, his cousins. Yet he completely misidentified how they would respond. He thought they would go, well, Vladimir Putin or Zelensky, what difference does it make? And that just wasn't true. Yeah. And they've proven now that they want to fight. They will fight for their own freedom.
Yeah, definitely. What are your thoughts as you see them stand up and fight for their country and what's playing out in that region?
Yeah, it's both inspiring and heartbreaking. I mean, it's hard for us to watch this nation that, you know, many people have been to. Some people have actually vacationed there. And to have it be destroyed just day after day after day. And to see the thousands and thousands of bodies that have been, we've been see in, you know, in television and print media, to see something approaching 3 million refugees now. And I'm afraid the outcome there is obviously heartbreaking for Ukrainian people, but also I don't see this ending anytime soon.
Is Vladimir Putin a war criminal, in your opinion, based on what we're seeing play out?
Well, you know, I want to be careful with the word and the phrase war criminal, because that's actually a legally defined term, a technical legal term. But he certainly should be investigated for conduct that would be war criminal or something like that. And whether he's technically a war criminal or not, he's clearly a brutal dictator who is, you know, his actions have obviously led to the deaths of tens of thousands of people, now innocent people. And
so how should he be held accountable?
Well, we're going to have to wait and see that, Glenn. I mean, first thing we want to do is end the violence there, end the war, do anything we can to protect Ukrainian people. And after that, I do think there's going to be an accounting, but I don't think you're going to have Vladimir Putin subject himself to a Western tribunal. It's just clearly that's not going to happen.
Are the U.S. and its allies and Ukrainian allies doing everything they should be doing, in your opinion?
Well, we lost an opportunity. As I was saying there, sometime between October and February, we knew that he would invade. Many of us were trying to move the administration, trying to convince them, hey, start sending weapons now. Send the Vulcan missile systems, send the drones, send the air or surface to air missiles, ammunition. And we lost about an 11 or 12-week window where we didn't. And now it's much, much harder to do that, obviously, as we try to move it across the Polish border in a war environment. Now, there's still more that we could do there. I think there's probably some further sanctions we should consider. But I want to be really clear as well, Glenn. I do not support sending American forces to engage and to fight Russian soldiers in Ukraine.
I want to get to one other thing on this point real quick. What do you think, or what do you make of when you take a look at how private companies and private institutions are responding to Russia. Is that having an impact and harming Russia?
It has had an impact, and I'm so glad they've been able to do that. And by the way, President Xi in China is surely watching that as well, as he evaluates, well, am I going to do the same thing in Taiwan? And I think it's been an overwhelming response from the private sector, both in the financial services, as far as sanctions. I mean, McDonald's, for heaven's sakes, there's many, many examples of business leaders just saying, look, we're not going to support this in any way.
Okay, our time is flying by, but I want to get into one other thing at least, and that's the economy. Recently, the Deseret News and Hinckley Institute polling Utahns to find out what is most important to them when it comes to Congress at this very moment, and it's getting the economy back on track. We're looking at record inflation. Here in Utah, our housing market skyrocketing, trillions in deficit. What are you and your Republican colleagues committed to doing to work with this administration in improving the economic outlook?
Yeah, that's a great question, and once again, this impacts everyone, but if you're a working person, if you're in the lower income brackets, it affects you far, far more than it does someone who's wealthy. And there's really only one solution to this now. It's not the supply chain interruptions. That's not the cause of inflation now. It's not Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. That had a marginal effect on the energy industry, but that's not the root cause of inflation. Inflation is because of government spending. We've spent $6.2 trillion in 18 months. And we simply have too much money in the economy now. And the only way to fix that, and I would love to work with the administration or any of my Democratic colleagues on simply getting a handle on how much money the federal government is spending and the deficits that result from that. That's the problem, and I'm afraid, honestly, this isn't going to be fixed by the weekend. We're going to probably be looking at inflation for at least several years. I'm really heartbroken to say.
So a lot of the conversation comes down to politics on both sides here. So what are some ways that both sides can meet in the middle to have significant impact on this situation?
Yeah, I honestly, I don't think there's much chance of that happening in the next 6 or 7 months until the 2022 election. I think much of the focus in Congress and, you know, in our nation's capital has turned to the election. But I hope that after the election, it will open up the opportunity to. I would love to start working with people tomorrow, and we shouldn't wait. But honestly, the political environment there is such that Nancy Pelosi controls the reins of powers, Chuck Schumer does, and the president does. And they just haven't indicated much of a willingness to say, hey, you on the Republican side, what could we do to work together? But perhaps after the midterms, there'll be a new day when we can.
Your answer there is fascinating to me, and I do believe it's true that it probably won't be addressed before the election. But how is it that we can have such an important, pressing issue that we can all just say, well, it's going to be pushed off until later?
Well, and that's why, Glenn, I wanted to say, look, I would start working on this tomorrow if we could. I'd do anything we could, but the core of this is government spending. The core of this is how many trillions of dollars the administration and their Democratic leaders have approved through Congress. And they're not talking about cutting that spending. They're talking about spending more and spending more. And I don't know how we reconcile those two things, other than perhaps the election that would bring them to the table if the midterms don't go well for them. Perhaps that compels them to say, okay, we need to take a new stance on this. But I don't want to delay it because it's a hard problem. I would engage in this in any way that we could. I think most Republicans would. It just seems like there's not the mood.
And you feel like you and your colleagues are making an honest attempt at doing just that?
For sure we are. I mean, for sure we are. We want to help the American people, and this isn't just a Republican or Democrat thing. Everyone is harmed by inflation, including, as I said, the working poor, the people who can least afford it. For sure we would try to work with them on this.
All right, Representative, we have run out of time. I would like to go into that deeper, but unfortunately, we have to go to break. Thanks so much for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Still to come, airlines ending mask requirements for employees and passengers following that ruling from the judge in Florida. Our panel will weigh in on that a little later. But first, President Biden renewing his push for his Democratic agenda, the domestic agenda, but Congress, do they have the appetite for it? That is the question. That story after the break. A judge in Florida striking down the federal mask mandate that applied to air travel and mass transit. But the sudden change created some confusion off the bat. Washington correspondent Alexandra Limon reports.
The Biden administration hasn't decided just yet whether it will appeal the ruling, but officials say that'll depend on whether the CDC decides it's necessary. TSA is not currently enforcing the federal mask mandate after the mandate was struck down by a judge.
Let's just call it what it is: chaos for the skies, chaos in train stations, and in subways and other.
James Hodge, a law professor at Arizona State University, says the sudden change is creating confusion, especially because some airports are in cities where indoor or public transit mask rules are still in place.
A question right now is who's in charge of those facility-related mask requirements.
It's still unclear if the ruling will be appealed.
If people continue to wear masks on planes,
that's up to them.
The Biden administration says an appeal depends on whether the CDC finds it necessary. For now, Secretary of Health and Human Services Javier Becerra urges Americans, especially those who are at high risk, to continue masking up while traveling and commuting.
I'll respect the ruling, but I follow the science.
While private businesses can still require masks, most major airlines said they're dropping mask mandates following the court ruling.
Some people should still wear their masks because they are at more risk because, they're immune compromised or something else. But for most of us, we appreciate the freedom.
I was glad that a lot of people had the mask on and they did not take it off.
But once you arrive in a city where mask mandates are still in place, the rules can change, especially once you leave the airport. The rules could, of course, be different if you're traveling internationally, so the best advice is to just carry a mask with you because you just don't know when you might need it. Reporting in Washington, Alexandra Limon.
President Joe Biden on the road talking about his administration's signature piece of legislation, the infrastructure law. Washington correspondent Rashad Hudson has the details.
The trip comes as President Biden is facing supply chain issues he says are driving up the prices for American families. The president says the new infrastructure law will help with those problems.
We have an infrastructure decade.
President Biden is trying to turn the country's attention back to his domestic agenda.
We've made a lot of progress, and we have an incredible opportunity ahead of us.
Tuesday, the president traveled to New Hampshire to highlight how billions of dollars from the bipartisan infrastructure law are being spent on rebuilding the nation's ports and waterways.
We're making the most significant investment in modernizing our roads and bridges since the interstate highway system was built with Eisenhower.
The White House says the president is trying to rescue parts of his agenda with items like child care, health care, and lowering the cost of prescription drugs.
The president is proud to go out in the country in blue states, red states, purple states to talk about his agenda.
Because those ideas haven't found the needed support in Congress, Todd Belt with George Washington University says the president is turning to the American people.
What he needs to get out there and do is say that we've passed a lot of plans last year that put a lot of money in your pocket. We helped you. And if the Republicans take over, you cannot count on that help to continue.
Belt says that public support needs to be bipartisan.
They might be able to get some Republicans to come over and help them, in which case they have a success that they can tout to voters.
And the president will continue to take his message directly to the American people later this week with trips to Washington State and Oregon. Reporting in Washington, Rashad Hudson, back to you.
Coming up, former President Donald Trump endorsing Senator Mike Lee. What impact will it all have on the race for Senate? Our panel weighs in after the break.
You're watching Inside Utah Politics.
Time now for a closer look at some of the big stories of the week with the Inside Utah Politics panel. This week we have State Representative Carol Spackman-Moss and State Auditor John Dugal. Thanks to both of you for being here. Appreciate it.
Great to be with you.
Let's start off with the federal judge repealing the mask mandate for public transportation. John, let's start with you. Your thoughts on that ruling?
Well, I think it's about time we get rid of masks on airplanes and other things like that. I think so many people were ready for this, and so I think I don't know all the dynamics of the judge's ruling, but I think society by and large was ready for this to be gone.
Representative, your thoughts?
Well, I'm glad to be rid of masks like everyone else. I don't wear one very often except if being in a confined space, but it's a dangerous precedent to have a judge, and she's a Trump-appointed judge, Judge Mizell, who did a ruling not based on health, and it's already legal scholars are writing articles about how she misinterpreted the rule. And not a single scientist or medical professional was consulted. And I think it will harm some people, especially on airplanes where you're in close quarters. I think it's a bad precedent.
John, dig into that a little bit more, if you will. Should judges or health professionals be making these decisions? Well,
at the end of the day, judges are the ones to determine whether something's legal or not. And I think, unfortunately, the CDC has lost credibility over the last 2 years with the pandemic. They've overreached in many areas, and it is up to judges to say whether or not in this case, the federal government has stepped too far. And you talk about safety on planes. We're at the point where my understanding is you can wear a mask if you want to protect yourself. You don't have to require everyone else to wear a mask.
Representative, hit on that point, if you will, because if you want to wear a mask, you still can do so, and that's what a lot of supporters who want to get rid of them are saying. Look, it's your choice. Go ahead and still do it.
Well, absolutely. I think that people are ready for it, and unfortunately, it has become, and almost from the beginning, it was a political issue. And if more people had been vaccinated, I would have felt much more secure about not wearing a mask. And so I don't fault the CDC. This was a new, novel virus, and they've done their best to keep up with the with this virus and with all the variants, because there'll be books written about this for decades, but they've tried to protect the public. And this judge out of Florida, why should her ruling affect millions and millions of people?
I'd like to dig into this a little more, but there are a couple of other topics I want to really get to, so let's move on. Let's move to the Senate race here in the state of Utah, specifically with incumbent Senator Mike Lee going for another term. Some interesting developments. We already knew that former President Trump endorsed Senator Lee. Then we start to see these emails come out that CNN, or text messages, I mean, that CNN released. So let's talk about how this is going to impact first, John, if at all, the primary election with Utah Republicans.
Well, I think the very first thing, Trump's endorsement, he offered his endorsement. He also gave his endorsement years ago to Mitt Romney. Sometimes he's quick to endorse various folks that he wants to support for various reasons. My understanding is Senator Lee did not ask for the endorsement, so I don't think it will matter one way or the other in his race. For a lot of folks that support Trump, Senator Lee is their best choice in the U.S. Senate race. For lots of others, it's a non-issue. When it comes to the text messages, I think what you see, if you look at the timeline, as I understand it, you see early on where President Trump and others are making the case that the election was stolen. Okay, you know, let's hear the information. You're making a credible argument, but as we see the process go along, there was no there. Folks did not provide the proof and other things like that, and you saw Senator Lee quickly backtrack in his initial support of pursuing any legal option for overturning the election to say, hey, if there's nothing there that can prove that this fraud took place, then this is a very dangerous path to go down.
Representative, before we send this over to you for your thoughts, I want to mention one thing. During the week, both senators were at an event, and members of the media were questioning Senator Lee, who did not take questions on the text messages, but also Senator Romney. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he said from what he has seen to this point, he's seen nothing illegal. But back to your point on how this could potentially play out here in the state of Utah.
Well, if the climate were different politically, I think it would do huge damage to him. I don't think anybody could read those and not think that he was trying to overturn a legal election. Yes, he backtracked, but he's also begging for help, to help me, tell me what to say. He said, I've spent hours and hours doing this. looking into this, trying to see if we can change state electors. This is really alarming, and my friends and acquaintances just think this is horrible, and yet he won't talk to the press. Why not, if he did nothing wrong? I mean, they're there for everyone to see. Will it hurt him politically, this convention? I doubt it.
Okay, let's move on to the general election potentially. If he were to get the nomination from the Republican Party, which polls at this point suggests he will, and a potential matchup with independent Evan McMullin, how could that potentially change the dynamic? John, we'll start with you, and I do want to point out Evan McMullin and his team were very quick to try to draw that connection between Senator Lee and former President Trump. They think that's an advantage for them.
You know, they may think that's an advantage. I don't think it really does much in this race. I will note that Senator Lee had 2 Republican opponents. One condemned him for what he did, and one, you know, that he was quote unquote trying to overturn the election. The other condemned him that he didn't fight to overturn the election. So he was getting condemned on both sides, with people overplaying what took place. And so I really don't think this is really going to matter in the general election.
Representative, you see anything changing in the general?
Well, sad to say, no, I don't. I think that he has enough supporters that he'll win this race. I think it's kind of a sad statement, though, that the Republican Party has gotten to this point where you can do almost anything and there are no repercussions. And the same thing with the Trump endorsement. I think in other times we saw more moderate candidates, more moderate Republicans. It would be a different story. He'd look radical, but unfortunately I don't think it will make a big difference.
I'm going to take a little issue there, Glenn.
Sure.
I mean, we've seen across the nation, we've seen Democrats also call into question elections. We've seen Democrats call into question vaccines and other things like that. And so, you know, if the good representative wants to say this is a problem on both sides of the aisle, then I would agree.
Do you agree with that, Representative?
No, I don't. I think there are some on the left, but not to the extent, not in the least, not to the extent it is in the Republican Party. That's always what the Republicans say, oh, it's just as bad on the left. I'm sorry, it is not. And they haven't condemned Democrats, as far as I know, vaccines. And I've seen a huge number of anti-vaxxers on the right.
John, anything else before we move on to the next?
I was just going to say, President Biden, when he was campaigning for president, called into question the Trump vaccine. And so right there at the top, he was questioning the vaccine from the get-go.
Okay, let's move on to one other thing. Is it just me, or are more challengers stepping up to try to run for office this election cycle? Representative, let's start with you on this one.
Yes, I think they are, but I question their reasons for running. Many of the people who have already defeated some really good incumbents on the Republican side are people who want to tear down institutions. This is happening from the school board, local school board level to the state school board, not just here in Utah, but in other states. And the motives are questionable. We just want to get rid of things that we think are damaging our kids that don't even exist. And it's very troubling to me. People used to run for office for more altruistic reasons, but not to tear down institutions like public schools, for example. So it's really concerning to me, the number, because of their motivations.
John, your thoughts on this issue. Do you see more people stepping up, and why?
Well, I do see a lot of folks stepping up. I think part of the dynamic is the last 2 years with the pandemic have agitated a lot of folks with various concerns. We've also seen a lot of issues when it comes to education, where folks have been at home, seeing what their kids are learning and being more concerned about different dynamics. And so they're stepping up. Now, some of those challengers will win in the process and some will lose, and hopefully many will learn a lot as they go through that process. But I think we live in a world in which more debate, I think, is a good thing. You get people out there sharing their ideas, their perspectives, and then we let the voters decide at the end of the day.
Okay, we will see how this all plays out. The stage is set now for the primary election. Very good conversation. Appreciate the insight from both of you this morning. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay with us. We'll be right back with more Inside Utah Politics right after the break. We leave you now with a look at what's on the radar in the world of politics. The stage is set for the primary election following the state conventions. Mail-in ballots will start to go out the week of June 7th, and then Election Day is Tuesday, June 28th. Make sure to connect with me on social media. I'd like to know what you think of this show and other issues that are important to you. You can email me at InsideUtahPolitics@abc4.com. You can also follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram and interact there as well. Thanks so much for making us part of your Sunday morning. We hope to see you again next week as we go inside Utah politics.